If you were looking at the globe in mid-1941, it would be almost impossible to argue that Adolf Hitler was anything less than the greatest military mind alive.
Oh, absolutely.
He had conquered virtually all of Europe in, well, in lightning speed, proving the superiority of his new blitzkrieg method.
Right. And the German propaganda was just relentless, proclaiming imminent victory and, the establishment of a thousand-year Reich.
It's the ultimate illusion, and that's what we're here to do today. Our stack of sources is designed to conduct a forensic examination of how that illusion shattered.
Exactly. We are tracking Hitler's life from a marginalized homeless youth in Vienna to the architect of a short-lived empire, and we're zeroing in on the exact pivot points when his own catastrophic decisions began to unravel the whole system.
That's the core tension we are exploring for you today. The massive growing gap between that triumphant propaganda machine led by Joseph Goebbels and the rotting logistical and psychological reality hidden just beneath the surface.
Yeah, we're focusing on the period starting in 1941, when the internal infighting began to surface, right up through the pivotal military blunders of 42 and 43.
So our mission is to move beyond just a biography and really analyze the strategic decline.
The trajectory is clear. Hitler achieved absolute power through daring, calculated risks, but his downfall was entirely self-inflicted. It was caused by ideological rigidity and, frankly, a pathological inability to tolerate any rational dissent.
We'll be looking at the internal battles, the logistical nightmares, and the personal decline that the German public was kept completely oblivious to. We're tracking his evolution from a political nonentity to a dictator, then analyzing the specific, pivotal blunders that turned a guaranteed short war into an impossible global conflict.
It's a journey from the very psychological wellspring of his hatred, forged in youthful humiliation, right into the dark, damp reality of the Führer bunker.
What strikes you most as we set this stage?
For me, it's the profound connection between the immense scale of the eventual catastrophe and the mundane personal failures of his youth. The sources repeatedly highlight that his enormous ego could not handle rejection or failure, and that psychological engine, always blaming external forces, it became the fatal flaw when he was put in charge of millions of men and the destiny of a nation.
That brings us to our starting point. The streets of Vienna between 1907 and 1913. If you look at the portrait of Adolf Hitler at age 21, the sources paint a figure of just utter marginalization and failure.
Oh, it was a truly miserable existence. I mean, he was homeless, struggling to survive the harsh Viennese winters, often sleeping on public benches. He relied entirely on public soup kitchens just to eat, some of which were managed by religious orders like the nuns at various monasteries. He was a complete nobody, a non-entity living in a men's hostel, which was, essentially a slum.
And the propaganda later tried to clean that up, right?
Oh, massively. They went to extreme lengths to fabricate a more respectable past, often claiming he lived in the much more attractive building next door.
He had artistic ambition, though. He wasn't just begging. He was trying to make a living selling his artwork.
Yes, his attempts to make money were entirely linked to art. He would copy images from postcards and then sell these small paintings, mostly architectural scenes, to tourists. He saw himself as a visionary artist.
But this brings us to the critical defining trauma of his life, the rejection by the elite.
Which was the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts.
Exactly. He failed the entrance exam not just once, but twice.
Twice.
And he viewed this moment, the failure to gain entry, as the worst moment of his life. He walked into that examination absolutely convinced that his genius would be immediately recognized. He expected acceptance. He demanded it.
And how did he manage to spin that profound personal failure into the foundation of a new ideology?
He couldn't process it as a failure of his own ability. The sources emphasize that one unshakable characteristic throughout his life was his conviction in his own genius. So it was never his fault.
Never. The failure was the fault of the short-sighted elite, the established cultural figures and professors who were too blind or too jealous to recognize his potential. This immense resulting personal fury was directed entirely outward.
And Vienna at the time was the perfect place for channeling that external fury.
It was a pressure cooker, absolutely ripe for anti-Semitic ideology to flourish. Vienna was fiercely anti-Semitic. Roughly 10% of the population was Jewish. And importantly, many held prominent positions in banking, law, culture, and intellectual life.
So he just connected the dots in his own mind.
Yes. He looked at the successful elites he felt rejected by, saw their prominent Jewish representation, and the conclusion was simple in his mind. His failure was caused by these figures, who had supposedly gained undue influence over Austrian society.
That explains why so much of his eventual book, Mein Kampf, is dedicated to creating this manufactured mythology.
We must always view Mein Kampf as pure, weaponized propaganda. It's a fictionalized autobiography designed to build the myth of the tireless, dedicated genius destined for leadership. He lied extensively about his background.
Like saying he never worked.
Right, claiming that he had never worked and lacked qualifications. He essentially took his profound shame and humiliation over his impoverished, failed youth and flipped it into a heroic narrative where he was the nation's unrecognized savior who had endured suffering.
But this period of intense personal suffering gives us one of the most remarkable paradoxes of his life, his relationship with the family doctor who treated his mother.
Yes, the death of his mother, Clara Hitler, in 1907, he adored her, and her death from breast cancer devastated him. The sources describe his desperate care for her, putting his bed right next to hers to watch over her throughout the final weeks. He was utterly broken when she died.
And the physician treating her was Dr. Edward Block.
Dr. Block was Jewish. Despite the burgeoning anti-Semitic ideas Hitler was absorbing in Vienna, he was profoundly grateful to Block for his compassionate, dedicated care. The paradox is this. Years later, when Hitler was fully implementing genocidal policy, he kept that promise of gratitude.
He actively protected Dr. Block.
He did. He used the expression Edler Jude, a noble Jew, a category he created just for this one man, entirely separate from all others. He ensured that Block was allowed to escape to the United States,
while simultaneously overseeing the systematic extermination of millions.
It's a disturbing insight into a mind capable of radical compartmentalization. Personal debt meant nothing to the political doctrine.
Which underscores that for Hitler, anti-Semitism was not just prejudice, it was a central, non-negotiable political and philosophical doctrine.
Exactly. We can trace the formalization of this doctrine back to his very first documented anti-Semitic text in 1919. This was a 4-page letter in which he described Jews not as human beings, but as parasites with a capital P or vermin who must be eliminated entirely.
And he said the goal had to be
The complete systematic removal of Jews from German territory. This was the ideological basis that would drive his later world-shattering decisions.
So if rejection and fury defined his years in Vienna, then World War I provided the opportunity to finally forge a usable, respectable identity.
The contrast is dramatic. When WWI began in 1914, Hitler was overcome with a feeling of patriotic euphoria. He saw the war as a chance to escape his miserable, failed destiny and forge himself anew.
There's that famous photograph of him in the crowd at Munich's Odeonsplatz, right?
Yes, seemingly in a state of patriotic ecstasy as war was declared. He immediately volunteered for the German army.
And he actually served the entire 4 years in the trenches. What did that service look like on the ground?
He served as a dispatch runner or courier, a vital but dangerous role, delivering messages between battalions and headquarters, often under fire. Objectively, he was a highly reliable soldier. Dutiful, focused, and trustworthy. The army provided him with the structure and the family he had desperately lacked.
But he remained isolated, even among his comrades.
Very much so. He didn't participate in the common discussions, the drinking, or the typical camaraderie of the trenches. He was often described as isolated and uncommunicative. His loyalty, however, was rewarded in December 1914 with his first ever distinction.
The Iron Cross Second Class.
This was enormous for him. For a 25-year-old who had nothing, no job, no home, no reputation, this decoration was his first social distinction. He was incredibly proud of it and wore it for the rest of his life. It validated the new, self-made identity he had found in service.
But that identity was violently ripped away by the 1918 collapse.
It was an unimaginable trauma because he simply couldn't comprehend it. He learned of Germany's defeat while lying on a hospital bed, temporarily blinded by a gas attack. The shock was absolute.
And like many nationalists, he couldn't believe they had lost on the battlefield.
Exactly. He came to believe Germany hadn't lost militarily, but had been betrayed by internal enemies, the liberal politicians, socialists, and crucially the Jews, who were blamed for forcing the punitive terms of the Versailles Treaty on the beaten nation.
This devastation pushed him into politics, but initially, it was still under the wing of the military.
Correct. The war didn't end for him. The battlefield simply shifted to the political arena. He needed to stay in the army, partly for the income, but primarily to fight those internal enemies. In 1919, he was recruited by Army intelligence.
Specifically, Captain Karl Mayer.
Yes, who recognized his zeal and asked him to spread the correct ideology of extreme nationalism among the demoralized returning troops. He was ideal because he was already known for his long, passionate, almost rambling monologues to his comrades. He couldn't handle a two-sided debate, but he could talk for hours and captivate a crowd.
So the army funded his transition from war courier to full-time propagandist, leading him directly to the German Workers' Party, the DAP, in 1919.
Joining the DAP, a small, anti-Semitic, ultra-nationalist fringe group, was the first concrete step toward Mauer. What immediately catapulted him beyond his peers was his extraordinary power as an orator.
The sources describe how he captivated audiences with an almost hypnotic charm and fervor. It wasn't just speaking, it was political theater.
Absolutely, this is crucial. He wrote every single one of his own speeches. He didn't rely on staff writers, unlike most modern politicians. He worked constantly on the rhythm, the intonations, and the dramatic gestures, often practicing his body language in front of a mirror.
A professional actor on the political stage.
You could say that. He was articulating the deep resentment many Germans felt. Tear up Versailles, reject democracy, and blame the Jews for the nation's suffering.
And that intoxicating blend of charisma and resentment fueled incredible growth for the party.
It did. From barely 200 members in late 1919, the party swelled to over 55,000 by the time of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch.
Which was the failed attempt to violently seize power. He famously fired his pistol into the ceiling.
The attempt failed, but it served two purposes. First, it confirmed his belief that violence was a necessary political tool. And second, it demonstrated his incredible, almost unbelievable luck. During the confrontation with police, his bodyguard, Ulrich Graf, shielded him and was struck by 11 bullets, saving Hitler's life.
11 bullets. That's a staggering close call.
And this happened repeatedly. He would survive nearly 11 documented assassination attempts throughout his lifetime. And he interpreted this constant survival as confirmation that he was protected by a divine providence.
A belief that would later drive his most reckless military decisions.
And the resulting prison sentence at Landsberg, rather than punishing him, became a kind of luxurious political retreat.
The sources often describe it as a 5-star prison.
It was. He enjoyed privileged conditions, receiving an endless stream of gift parcels, visitors whenever he liked, and deference from the guards. He used this extraordinary leisure time, aided by Rudolf Hess, his future deputy Führer, to write Mein Kampf.
This book, written in comfort, was essentially a full blueprint for World War II, laid out a decade before it started.
It was his ideological and military manifesto. It outlined his vision of German racial superiority, the Jews as microbes or vermin who must be exterminated, and he used language that clearly meant kill or destroy.
And it dictated his foreign policy.
Lebensraum. Expansion into the east for living space, and the total destruction of the French army to secure the western flank. He issued a warning to the world, stating that if Germany didn't take these steps, the nation would simply die.
After his release, he switched tactics, using the democratic process to gain legitimacy before ultimately discarding it, culminating in his appointment as chancellor in 1933. Once in power, the machinery for covert rearmament, despite the Versailles Treaty, was immediately put in a high gear.
The restrictions of Versailles were draconian. A small, 100,000-man army, absolutely no heavy artillery, no tanks, and no combat aviation. The brilliance of the strategy was the camouflage.
Hiding military planning under civilian organizations.
Right, and commercial enterprises.
So how did they bypass international inspection and finance this secret war machine?
They employed several sophisticated methods simultaneously. First, they maintained covert links with the Soviet Union, conducting secret weapons testing on Russian soil, far from prying eyes. Second, the financing was ingenious. They used a system of fictitious bills of exchange known as MEFO exchange bills, or MEFEXL.
MEFEXL, how did that manage to hide arms production costs?
MEFEXL was essentially a large-scale confidence trick played on international creditors. These bills were issued by 4 dummy companies, and they guaranteed payment from the Reich's state budget, but the purpose of the debt was entirely masked.
So banks would buy them thinking they were investing in normal industry.
Exactly. This allowed Germany to rapidly finance the purchase of steel, parts, and specialized machinery necessary for tank and aircraft production without these enormous expenditures ever appearing in official, inspectable state budgets.
That is profound financial deceit. And on the public front, they masked war preparation as public works.
Precisely. Job creation was sold as social policy aimed at alleviating mass unemployment. They invested heavily in infrastructure railways and the massive network of autobahns.
which were showcased as monuments to German modernity, but were really engineered for war.
They were strategic arteries. They featured long, straight stretches with wide, reinforced bridges designed specifically to handle the immense weight of heavy panzer tank divisions and motorized units. Initially, they lacked speed limits to facilitate rapid troop movement. Public works were military logistics in disguise.
This covert preparation set the stage for the crucial turning point in 1935.
That's when the charade ended. Hitler openly announced compulsory military service, transforming the small Reichswehr into the enormous Wehrmacht. The army quickly swelled to millions, and the Luftwaffe, already secretly developed, was officially established under Hermann Goering.
And the Luftwaffe was specifically tailored to the emerging blitzkrieg strategy.
Absolutely. Unlike the massive strategic bombers used by the Allies later, the German Air Force was focused on tactical support. Dive bombers like the Stuka and fast fighters. They were designed to act as an integral shock and awe component of the ground forces.
A unified, rapid coordination that was the foundation of the Lightning War doctrine, as the inverse of WWI attrition.
Exactly. Blitzkrieg prioritized speed, surprise, deep penetration by armored divisions, and coordinated air support to destroy command and control centers immediately, causing an enemy's resistance to collapse internally.
And the first test of that doctrine was the Poland campaign in September 1939.
A brutal and rapid application of force, the entire campaign began with the massive lie of the Glidowitz incident.
Where German forces disguised as Poles staged a fake attack on a German radio station to justify the invasion.
The attack commenced at 4:45 a.m. on September 1st. German air supremacy was immediate, and the ground forces, utilizing 2,500 tanks and 1.5 million men, advanced at astonishing speed. Poland was crushed in barely 6 weeks.
This confirmed, in Hitler's mind, that he was a strategic genius.
Completely, and that overconfidence carried over into the Western Front in 1940. Total, unbridled euphoria.
He achieved in 6 weeks what the entire German Empire couldn't manage in 4 years of WWI.
And the invasion strategy was audacious. Bypass the formidable French Maginot Line entirely by invading the neutral nations, and then punching through the unexpected, lightly defended Ardennes forests.
The Allies were caught strategically flat-footed.
Completely. The speed, mobility, and shock of the combined panzer and air attacks were devastating. Allied resistance collapsed within weeks. The campaign was a total, stunning victory, culminating in the occupation of Paris.
And he forced the French delegation to sign the armistice in the exact same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918.
A profound, deeply personal validation for him. The illusion of invincibility was cemented globally.
But the very first crack, a strategic limitation that was impossible to hide, appeared almost immediately afterward, the Battle of Britain.
Yes. Operation Sea Lion, the planned ground invasion, required air dominance first. The fate of the invasion rested entirely on Goering and the Luftwaffe.
And Goering fundamentally misjudged the situation.
He did. The Luftwaffe initially focused their attacks on airfields and the critical British radar stations. However, British defenses proved unexpectedly robust, partly due to radar and partly because German fighters had limited range over Britain.
So the tactical superiority on the ground did not translate into air dominance.
Not at all. Sensing failure, Goering panicked and shifted strategy in September, diverting efforts to terror bombing major cities, particularly London.
To break British morale.
That was the aim, but it failed spectacularly. The British population adapted, industrial capacity replaced lost aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them, and morale did not break. With losses mounting, the ground invasion had to be postponed indefinitely.
That failure, the inability to achieve air superiority over the Channel, was the first undeniable limit of German power.
It was a crucial strategic setback. The crack had appeared. The narrative of inevitable, constant, flawless progress was broken, and this setback was a preview of the immense self-inflicted blunders that were about to follow.
The facade of a united, infallible leadership cracked open publicly in the early summer of 1941, just before the invasion of Russia. We have to address the incredible absurdity of the Hess embarrassment.
This incident was a massive internal crisis for Hitler, perhaps the single biggest embarrassment the regime ever suffered on the global stage. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, Hitler's oldest associate.
The co-author of Mein Kampf.
Right. He flew a solo mission and parachuted into Scotland, claiming he was there to negotiate peace with Britain. The British leadership viewed it as a diplomatic mission carried out by a lunatic.
What drove a figure as senior as Hess to undertake such a bizarre, unauthorized solo mission?
The sources reveal his motivation was intensely personal and political. Hess was rapidly losing influence and prestige. He was worried about his position amidst the seething mass of rivalry and infighting that characterized the top echelon of the Nazi hierarchy.
So less a peace effort, more a desperate high-stakes career Hail Mary.
Precisely. It exposed for the first time a profound fracture at the very top of the leadership. Hitler was absolutely incandescent when he learned of it. The fiction of Nazi unity was publicly and messily destroyed.
And this put Joseph Goebbels in the toughest position of his propaganda career. How did he spin the deputy Führer defecting?
It was a spin doctor's nightmare. How do you explain your second-in-command abandoning the cause? His solution was audacious. Portray Hess as a one-off rotten apple, claiming he had lost his reason or gone mad under the crushing pressure of his duties.
Did the public accept that?
Not easily. As the sources confirm, many Germans privately wondered, if the deputy Führer was actually insane, why was he still entrusted with such an important post? The crisis passed, but the gap between the illusion of perfect leadership and the reality of feuding rivals was now seriously exposed.
That internal crack was about to be turned into a chasm by the single greatest military blunder of Hitler's career, Operation Barbarossa.
Invading Russia in June 1941 was unavoidable for Hitler, driven by ideology above all else. It was the final, total showdown with communism, and crucially, the fulfillment of his central goal of securing Lebensraum in the Slav East.
Conquering territories occupied by people the Nazis viewed as racially inferior.
Barely human, in their words.
In the beginning, it looked like a repeat of the 1940 Blitzkrieg success.
The initial triumphs were stunning. German troops penetrated hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, sometimes within just a few rakes. They took over 1.5 million Soviet prisoners of war. Hitler, in the autumn of 1941, was utterly convinced he had won, declaring, "Russia is destroying and it will never rise again."
But the scope of the operation terrified his most experienced commanders from day one.
The logistical catastrophe was unavoidable. Generals worried privately about the sheer vast scale. Hitler, the self-appointed military genius, ignored every piece of rational logistical advice. His command strategy was simple: ignore reality and call the commanders daily, demanding they go faster.
But military logistics don't accelerate just because the Führer screams down the phone.
They absolutely do not. German supply chains were stretched to the breaking point, and the Soviet railways used a different track gauge than the German railways, meaning supplies had to be unloaded at the border and reloaded, causing massive delays.
And then the Russian winter hit with legendary ferocity.
The reality check was brutal. Temperatures outside Moscow plummeted to a paralyzing -32 degrees Fahrenheit. German soldiers were not equipped with winter gear. They had been promised victory in 6 weeks. Fuel froze, engine oil turned to sludge, and rifles literally froze solid. Troops were forced into an emergency tactical retreat.
Sources detail the absolute misery of the soldiers on the ground.
I mean, they were facing impossible conditions. Starting, and the desperate scarcity meant their best source of sustenance was raw horse, flesh-eaten raw, because cooking smoke would attract the attention of relentless Russian snipers.
Hitler had promised 6 weeks, and they were retreating after 5 months. Goebbels had to invent a narrative to cover the lie.
He launched a massive propaganda offensive. Newsreels suddenly appeared showing German soldiers enjoying the snow, routing a disorganized Russian rabble. Goebbels pushed his crews constantly to the front lines to try and frame Hitler's strategic decisions as genius, but the gap between the promise and the reality was now impossible for anyone involved to ignore.
And as Barbarossa stalled, Hitler committed what many historians argue was his single greatest strategic blunder, declaring war on the United States.
This decision, made in December 1941 after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, was taken almost unilaterally. The case against engaging America was overwhelming and obvious.
Because America was the sleeping giant?
It possessed vast, almost limitless economic resources. Once those resources were converted to military production, turning its massive car factories into tank assembly lines, Germany could never hope to compete. They had the power to outproduce the entire Axis combined.
So why the decision, taken after only the briefest consultation?
It was driven entirely by pure, unadulterated ideological contempt. Hitler fundamentally underestimated America, viewing it as racially worthless, a mongrel racial melting pot full of Hispanics and Jews.
He dismissed Americans as feeble.
He believed they utterly lacked the stomach for a fight and would quickly accept terms leaving Germany victorious in Europe.
He took the initiative, forcing Germany, which was already bogged down in the Russian snow, to face the world's most powerful industrial country.
It was a momentous decision made on the basis of racial fantasy, not military reality. The conflict was transformed from a European war into a global one. The ferocious hammer blows that would ultimately shatter Hitler's image completely were now guaranteed.
The final, defining catastrophe of this period, which confirmed the shift in momentum, was the Battle of Stalingrad from 1942 to 1943.
This was where Hitler's inflexibility led to the destruction of an entire army. The German Sixth Army besieged the industrial city, and the fighting descended into what the sources call uniquely messy urban warfare.
And the Russians executed brilliant flanking maneuvers, completely encircling 250,000 German troops.
The situation became immediately untenable. Supplies ran low, disease spread rapidly, soldiers were covered in lice, sanitary conditions collapsed entirely. They desperately needed a tactical retreat to survive.
But Hitler, sitting hundreds of miles away in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, refused.
His ideological rigidity had hardened into dogma. He demanded they stand and fight to the last man. His generals warned him an entire army would be wiped out, but Hitler insisted that good Nazis do not retreat. His personal reputation was more important than the lives of 250,000 men.
This strategic folly is often intertwined with the physical and mental decline of Hermann Goering.
Goering saw this as his chance for redemption. He enthusiastically promised the Fuhrer that his Luftwaffe could reinforce the trapped Sixth Army via massive airdrops.
But by 1942, Goering was not operating at full capacity.
Far from it. Goering was heavily dependent on morphine, leading to severe indolence and deeply clouded judgment. He was increasingly preoccupied not with military strategy, but with a bizarre, feverish obsession with accumulating looted art. He amassed a personal collection of around 1,200 precious objects.
So his preoccupation with drugs and stolen art meant the logistical failure was guaranteed.
A total disaster from the start. To sustain the encircled army, military experts calculated that 800 tons of supplies were needed daily. The Luftwaffe, led by the detached Goering, managed to deliver less than 100 tons per day. The airdrop failed spectacularly.
The German commander finally defied Hitler and surrendered. What were the consequences?
Nearly 100,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, and the remainder were either dead or wounded. This was a catastrophe of such immense scale that it was impossible to hide. Stalingrad was the point at which the word defeat truly took hold in the German public consciousness for the very first time.
Stalingrad forced a complete, immediate pivot for the entire Nazi regime. The narrative of quick, easy victory was dead. Goebbels had to turn the propaganda machine on a dime toward a new philosophy: total war.
The new strategy was centered on a relentless demand for sacrifice. They replaced the narrative of lightning victory with one of uniquely German grit and heroism and embracing suffering.
The most iconic display of this shift was Goebbels' famous total war speech in February 1943. He delivered it to 14,000 wildly cheering fans.
It was a spectacle of rhetorical manipulation. He demanded ever-increasingly loud yeses to a series of rhetorical questions, famously asking, "Do you want a total war that's even more radical and brutal?" He's transforming defeat into a glorious, heroic sacrifice.
But beneath the rhetoric of heroism was pure distilled terror.
Absolutely. Goebbels ensured that this call to heroism was underpinned by a nightmare vision of what defeat would bring. He promised that if they lost, the Germans would be driven out of their ancestral lands, their women raped, and their youth enslaved. They had no choice, he argued, but to fight on to the absolute bitter end.
This ideological shift required a total mobilization of the German economy.
Yes, and that massive undertaking fell to Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments. Speer implemented profound, ruthless reforms, centralizing arms production, rationalizing raw material use, and cutting duplication. The regime actually celebrated what they called the Speer miracle, because output of tanks and munitions actually increased even under Allied bombing.
But that increased production was achieved through a horrific human cost.
Yes. This efficiency was predicated on the systematic exploitation of human labor. It relied heavily on millions of forced laborers from occupied territories, and, despite the Nazi discourse on the woman's role being in the home, women were massively entering the industrial workforce from 1943 onward.
As the military situation deteriorated, we see the few brave, desperate signs of open opposition finally emerge within the Reich.
The resistance, though limited, was profoundly significant. The White Rose Group in Munich, led by students like Hans and Sophie Scholl, began circulating anti-Nazi leaflets and painting anti-Hitler graffiti messages like Hitler mass murderer or just the single word freedom.
And they were brutally suppressed for it.
Swiftly, brutally, and publicly.
The most dangerous and coordinated challenge, however, came from within the military establishment.
That was the 20th July plot in 1944. A group of disillusioned military officers, led by Colonel Stauffenberg, decided they had to remove the Führer to save Germany. Stauffenberg placed a bomb during a conference at the Wolf's Lair. The explosion happened, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries.
And his reaction to surviving reinforced his megalomania.
Absolutely. He was immediately convinced that he was once again protected by fate or by God. The regime's response was a massive, immediate wave of arrests, purges, and executions.
The state of the Reich was becoming so fragile that Hitler had to rely increasingly on repression, not goodwill, to maintain order.
That reality is confirmed by the highly significant appointment in 1943 of Heinrich Himmler, the fanatical head of the SS, as Minister of the Interior. Placing the SS chief in charge of all internal security was a clear sign. Hitler's grip on power now depended entirely on surveillance and ruthless repression.
While the home front was being mobilized and repressed, the Allied hammer blows abroad were transforming the military reality.
The sleeping giant was fully awake. American troops routed the Germans in North Africa. A month later, the Western Allies invaded Italy. This led to the rapid overthrow of Benito Mussolini, Hitler's oldest and most faithful European ally. It was a profound personal shock to Hitler.
Germany was now fighting on three massive fronts, and the home front was paying a terrible price from the air.
The Allied air war intensified dramatically. Hamburg was devastated in August 1943 by a massive firestorm that killed an estimated 40,000 people in a single night. This made the reality of a long, losing war undeniable for the German population.
As the Reich crumbled, we see the physical and mental decline of the dictator himself running in parallel.
His withdrawal became total. He retreated first to the Wolf's Lair and then, in early 1945, entirely to the subterranean Führer bunker in Berlin. He grew increasingly detached from reality, refusing to leave the bunker and avoiding any general who brought bad news.
What was his physical state like during that final year?
By age 55, the physical decay was shocking. He was visibly stooped, shuffled when he walked, and suffered from a pronounced tremor in his left hand and leg, which historians widely interpret as advanced symptoms of Parkinson's disease.
And he was heavily medicated.
Extraordinarily so. He relied completely on his personal physician, Theodor Morell, who was administering a cocktail of up to 28 different medications and injections daily.
28 drugs a day.
A mix of powerful opiates, sedatives, and even bizarre treatments like injections of animal hormones. The sources suggest this constant intake left him effectively a drug-addicted invalid, leading a global war from an underground complex.
And his routine reflected this bizarre isolation and decline.
Absolutely. He rarely woke before noon. His inner circle shrank. His only social interaction, outside of military briefings, was holding long, repetitive monologues to his secretaries during his tea ritual, often around 2 a.m. These became unbearable for his remaining staff.
So he just sought comfort from his dog and Eva Braun.
His German shepherd, Blondie, and his girlfriend, Eva Braun, whom he kept hidden from the public eye to maintain the image of the dedicated soldier monk.
This sets the stage for the final, dark conclusion in the bunker.
By April 1945, the end was unavoidable. Russian troops were advancing directly into Berlin. During a briefing on April 22nd, Hitler learned that the forces he was still ordering into battle simply didn't exist. The realization finally struck him. The war was truly over.
And before the end, he conducted two final symbolic acts in that grim, damp, moldy bunker.
First, he married Eva Braun in the strictest secrecy in the early morning of April 29th. Immediately after, he dictated his political testament.
That testament, signed just hours before his death, is perhaps the most horrifying summary of the entire Nazi madness.
It confirmed his unwavering, unrepentant ideology. He used the document to blame everyone but himself. The German army officers and the German people for failing him. And most chillingly, he explicitly reaffirmed his policy of Jewish extermination, ordering his successors to continue it.
That document proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, his total awareness of and absolute pride in the scale of the Holocaust, 6 million lives destroyed.
Absolutely. The final act came on April 30th, 1945 at 3:30 p.m. To ensure certainty, he took a poison capsule and shot himself simultaneously. His devoted staff immediately carried his body out into the Chancellery garden, doused it with petrol, and burned it.
To avoid the posthumous humiliation suffered by Mussolini.
Yes. But even in death, his influence continued with one final, decades-long secret.
What was that?
Because the burning was incomplete, Soviet forces recovered the remains. But Joseph Stalin concealed the critical identification information verified via dental records from the world for years, not confirming the death until 1968.
Why the secrecy? Years after the war was won.
The sources suggest Stalin did this strategically to sow confusion among the Western allies, but also to justify harsh Soviet policies in post-war East Germany by continually stoking the fear that the Führer might still be alive and could return.
That was a tremendous deep dive, moving from youthful humiliation right through to the inevitable bunker-bound decline. What stands out is the single most critical insight from this entire trajectory.
The primary insight is how brittle the entire system was. Hitler's initial terrifying success, the Blitzkrieg victories, was built on calculated risk and Goebbels' brilliant, relentless propaganda. But his ultimate downfall was rooted in that psychological fragility we trace back to Vienna.
His ideological rigidity and his ego's pathological inability to tolerate rational dissent.
Exactly. The moment he ignored logistics in Russia and refused the tactical retreat at Stalingrad, the facade cracked permanently under the weight of his own blunders.
He purged his most experienced generals and committed Germany to a fight with the U.S. based entirely on racial contempt and overconfidence.
And we cannot overstate the crucial, terrifying role of propaganda in sustaining the lie. Even when facts are catastrophic, Hess as a madman, Stalingrad as a heroic sacrifice, the machine kept churning, using terror and fear to force the German people into total war long after military victory was objectively impossible.
That illusion of invincibility was sustained only by the singular, unyielding vision of one man.
Indeed. The source material notes that Hitler only considered the war lost when he personally lost the fight, feeling life had no meaning without military victory. Given his intense personal obsession with conflict, he titled his whole existence, My Struggle. This raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider as we conclude.
The final provocative thought.
Was the catastrophic trajectory of World War II, a conflict that cost tens of millions of lives, determined less by grand geopolitical forces, industrial might, or economic imperatives, and more by the fragile, ego-driven, and ultimately rigid psychology of one single man who simply could not and would not accept contradiction?